I'm Jennifer Brown, and on behalf of the Center for Literary Arts at Frostburg State University, I'd like to welcome you to the 15th Annual Western Maryland Independent Literature Festival, and especially to this event with Brad Barkley. Before I talk about him, though, I'd like to thank the sponsors who make our work possible. This includes the Allegheny Arts Council, the City of Frostburg, Savage Mountain Punk Arts, and several offices at Frostburg State University, including the Office of the President, the Office of the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and the Department of English and Foreign Languages and Literature. Brad Barkley is the author of 2 novels, Money Love and Allison's Automotive Repair Manual. He has published 2 collections of short stories, Circle View and Another Perfect Catastrophe. His short fiction has appeared in magazines including Southern Review, Georgia Review, and the Oxford American. He's also published the young adult novels Scrambled Eggs at Midnight and Dream Factory. He's won, frankly, too many awards to name. Additionally, he's my colleague here at Frostburg State, and he's an avid fly fisherman on our gorgeous local rivers. Please join me in welcoming Brad Barkley.
Thanks, Jen. I appreciate that. Yeah, I probably should mention the fishing. If you know the picture you pulled for Floaty-Groundy was perfect. And as Leonard Skinner said, if you want to talk fishing, I guess that'll be okay. So if anybody has fishing questions, we can go in that direction. But we're here to talk about fiction writing. And what I want to do is explain what this whole floaty-groundy concept is, first of all, why it exists and where it came from, and then sort of define my terms. And then I'll explain it pretty quickly, a couple examples, and then leave time for questions if anybody has any. This floaty-groundy, I mean, the words are so strange because they're not writing textbook words. They came about through private conversations with a friend of mine, a really terrific writer you all should know, named Susan Paribeau. And we were just talking over breakfast, and we were talking about why some stories just don't work. Like this particularly applied to short stories at the time, but later on, I discovered this model sort of applies to novels as well, just as easily. Sometimes you've got, let's say it's a short story, and it ticks all the boxes. It's got 3-dimensional characters. It's got conflict. It has rising action. You're writing scenically. You've got a good sense of movement and momentum through the story, and it just check. It feels like it checks all the boxes, but for whatever reason, it just kind of sits there. It's just kind of dead. It doesn't jump off the page. And so we were talking about that. Why would that be? What's missing? And so what we really kind of zoomed in on finally was this connection between character and plot. And that's a weird connection because obviously, for fiction writers, character is king, right? You can imagine a story that has characters but no real plot, but you can't imagine a story that has a plot but no characters, right? So character is always king, but the two are intertwined, and they're like deeply, like in a twisted sinew and muscle kind of way intertwined. They're really hard to separate out. So this model is an attempt to do that separating out between character and plot, and sort of see where one isn't working, the other is, but this one isn't working, but the other one is, and sort of apply this model and just sort of give you some clarity about that connection point between those two. All right, so the reason, floaty-groundy, when you're talking with your friends, you just stick a label on something that doesn't have a label. It doesn't matter what you call it. As I said, students over the years have had fun with this name, calling it the Bloated Townie or the Floating Brownie or the whatever. Call it anything you want. It's just, the concepts are what are important here. You can call them Wilma and Betty if you want to. I don't care. So let me. I'm going to use my low tech whiteboard here. We've got plot. We've got character. Everybody see that? Is that backwards on your screen? Is that okay? It's good. Good. Okay. And we've got this idea of floaty, and we've got this idea of groundy. Okay. So you can draw these arrows in any direction. In other words, we can have a grounded plot, or we can have, skip that one, or we can have a floaty plot, right? We can have a grounded character, or we can have sort of a floating character, right? It can go in either direction. What do I mean by that? Well, let me define my terms here. A grounded plot, let's start with that one. All right. So in my head, you can see that this is a GP, a grounded plot. That's the worst P ever. All right. This is a grounded plot. A grounded plot is a plot. And by plot, I just mean what happens in the story. I'm not using this in any, very academic way, just what's happening in the story. A grounded plot is one that has a very definite dramatic frame. For example, you might have a story about a woman, let's say, who's meeting her estranged husband at a restaurant to talk on Tuesday night. He's getting ready to take a job in Vietnam, and she has to decide by Tuesday night whether she's going to reconcile with him or not. She has a decision to make, and it has to happen by Tuesday night. So it's grounded in that. It's grounded in that timeline and sort of that what I call a ticking clock. All right. My favorite one, I almost wrote a story about this one time. An alcoholic ex-tightrope walker has to sober himself up in time to make a walk across Niagara Falls on Saturday morning, right? Is he going to be sober in time? Now, it's grounded in time, not to beat a dead horse, but it's grounded in time because he's either going to sober up and make that walk or he's not. And it's going to be decided on that Saturday morning scene. The story doesn't extend beyond that, right? It's about that. We're aiming at that time frame on Saturday morning. A floaty plot, think of it as floating or floaty, has conflict. Now, this is important. Both of those are, the woman meeting her husband, there's conflict there, or tension. The alcoholic tightrope walker, there's tension there, right? Or is he going to fall and die? That's our tension. The floating plot still has tension. It still has conflict, but there are no constraints on it. So for example, you might have let's say you have a story about a woman and her adult son lives in her basement and he's a heroin addict. I'm picking really extreme examples here, but sometimes that makes the point clearer. There's no time constraint on that, right? She's a problem. I mean, he's a problem for her right now. He's ruining her life in a lot of ways. He's stealing all her money. And if he's still down there a year from now, he's probably even a worse problem. If he's down there, still a heroin addict 5 years from now, he's still a problem, right? If you're Eric Clapton's mom, he might be a heroin addict for 30 years, right? So it's just ongoing. There's tension, there's conflict in it, but nothing has to be resolved by any particular timeline, right? It's just ongoing. It just sort of floats along the surface of the story. All right, so that's grounded plot and floaty plot. All right. Now, when we talk about character, a grounded character. So we talked about grounded plot. We talked about floaty plot. So now we'll talk about a grounded character. All right. A grounded character is one who, every character wants something. A grounded character I'll say every main character wants something. If not, if you have a main character and you can't say what he or she wants, that may be the very problem we're talking about. But every character wants something. A grounded character wants something specific, something real, something that exists in reality, right? The you could sum it up in a short phrase. He wants his partner back. She wants a new job. He wants to stop drinking. She wants to reconcile with her daughter, right? So you can say in a phrase what it is this character wants. So that's a grounded character because it's a real thing, sort of it's a solid thing. Our feet are on the ground, and so that's what grounds that part of the story. The character is grounded in his or her wants. Okay. All right. Finally, and we'll start. Hang with me. We're going to combine these in a minute. A floating character. A floating character is the kind of character we see a lot in a lot of quote unquote literary fiction. They're just angsty, right? It's hard to say what it is that they want, but they're unhappy. They're something's bothering him. If you had to say what does this character want, you'd have to resort to abstract words. You'd have to resort to abstractions. She wants a different kind of life. He wants to break out of his sadness. He wants to, so as soon as you sort of pull out the abstractions, you're into sort of floaty character territory, because it's not a specific thing like I want a job, I want to put this bottle down, I want to give up cigarettes, whatever it is, right? He's angsty, he's unhappy. It's the kind of novel where we get lots of long walks on the beach and the characters thinking about capital L life and just unhappy, right? And it's pretty common, as I said, in particular, we see this a lot in literary fiction, where we're kind of taking the time to delve more into psychology of character and sort of probe their unhappiness, or even if it's not unhappiness, dissatisfaction with some area of life, right? So they're dissatisfied, not connected to any particular thing. Okay. So that's our terms. We've got grounded plot, grounded character, floaty character, right? We look at problems and solutions where we start combining these within a story, all right? So let's say you have a story that's a groundy. We have anybody can see that. We have a grounded character and a grounded plot. So that means that the character wants something very specific that exists in the real world, and he or she has to have that thing within a certain time constraint, right? What does that sound like? It sounds like every action adventure movie you ever watched, right? There's a channel right now on my Roku TV that's showing marathon of every Die Hard movie ever made, back to back to back to back, and then repeat. So I watched the first one. I'm a pretty big fan of that movie. Second favorite Christmas movie. It's and what does John McClane want? Right, he wants to get his wife out from under the hostage situation with Hans Gruber, and he has to do it before Hans Gruber either blows up the building or decides to kill all the hostages, right? So he wants a specific thing, get his wife out of that building, and it has to happen before Hans Gruber decides he's going to murder all the hostages, right? So that's a grounded. What's good about that? Well, it's real edge of your seat, right? So if you apply this to a short story or a novel, it's the kind of thing that keeps us turning pages. We keep asking what's going to happen. Is he going to make it? Of course, it's Bruce Willis. We know he's probably going to make it, but that's the fun of that story, right? And so that grounded element is good in that, we, in terms of writing, we want to keep turning pages. It's the kind of book where you say, I'm going to get to this end of this chapter and then I'm going to put the bookmark in and go to sleep. And you get to the end of the chapter and you say, no, I'm going to read one more chapter, right? So that's a good thing. What's not so good about the groundy is that it tends to, like a river, if it's moving quickly, it's shallow water, right? So we don't delve a lot into character. Now we get, my example I'm using, Die Hard, we get a fair amount of character because Bruce Willis is a good actor, but not a lot. I mean, we get a little bit, like their marriage is strained. We're not exactly sure why. He's funny and vulnerable in ways, but we just barely get under the surface of John McClane there. So why? We don't have time. The story is under time constraints. There's a big ticking clock in the background. So we don't have time to slow down and sort of delve into character. And oftentimes those stories aren't meant to do that anyway. They're just meant to entertain, keep us a little breathless, and nothing wrong with that. I love those kinds of stories. But if we want that sort of deeper, richer experience that we get from our favorite novels, we've got to find ways to slow down and sort of delve into character a little bit. Groundy is not going to give us that. A groundy story is not one you're going to be thinking about a month later after you finish the book. It usually raises one question: is he going to get his wife out of the building in time? Then it answers that question, and then we're done. We don't have anything else left to think about, right? All right. Here. So let's go to the opposite here. A floaty. So we've got a floating character who's just sort of genuinely, generally unhappy, angsty, dissatisfied with life, and is, not making any particular moves to get out of that. Our attention is in his or her unhappiness, but just sort of floating through life. And again, this is sort of the long walks on the beach kind of story or novel, thinking about capital L life, and sort of vaguely working his or her way out of this unhappiness or this dissatisfaction, trying to connect with people or whatever it is, but there's no particular time frame around it. Why? Because the plot is floating. The character doesn't really can't really say what they want because the character's floating, right? So what's good about that? Well, here we've got all the time in the world to delve into character, to delve into psychology, to sort of probe that deep dissatisfaction. It's very universal. All of us have felt that kind of dissatisfaction, or sort of that, that quiet desperation, as it's called, that we just feel and we can't exactly source. And so it's very human, it's very relatable. But conversely, those stories tend to be a little slow, right? As I said, I tell my students, this is the kind of story or novel where you feel like you should really be soaking this in because it feels like very important fiction, capital V, capital I, capital F. But you catch yourself skimming, right? It's very important fiction, but you start kind of skimming the pages a little bit because it's a little bit slow, right? Lots of psychology, lots of depth of character, but not much feeling like we're moving toward anything. The book kind of churns along. There's not a lot of momentum, right? So again, with all of these models, there are good things and there are bad things, and you kind of have to weigh those. To my mind, the best stories are the Floaty-Groundies, right? We mix the two. And it can go either way. You can have a floaty character, but then find a way to ground the plot some way. Or you can, well, let's talk about that. Floaty character is just sort of, again, angsty, dissatisfied, unhappy, but somehow circumstances force that character to make a change. So there's some outside element, some outside force that forces that character's hand. They can't just be walking on the beach anymore and thinking deep thoughts. They have to do something. That something has to change, and that comes usually from outside to sort of force them out of their floatiness. Or you can go the other opposite way with it. The plot is generally floaty, but then the character decides to ground themselves. All right, so I'll talk about both here. I'll give you some examples. My favorite example of the Floaty-Groundy, where we've got a floating character, which, let me do a little sidebar here. If you're writing, if you're writing a lot of short stories, if you're again, I don't love this phrase, but quote unquote literary writer, you're probably more inclined to write floaty characters, that angsty character that we get to spend time deeply exploring, right? If you're more a sort of a genre writer, you might be inclined to write more of a grounded sort of story, right? A groundy. In which case you might benefit by floating your characters a little bit. All right, sidebar over. Let me talk about some examples here. There's a famous story by John Updike called A&P, which has been anthologized 9 million times. And I like to use it as an example, for one thing, because it's easy to find. If you have never read this story, just Google A&P, name of grocery store chain, by John Updike, and you can find a dozen PDF copies out there for free. In fact, it's probably in public domain by now, maybe. So for those of you who don't know the story, quick synopsis. Our main character is 19-year-old Sammy, who works as a bag boy in a grocery store. And his co-worker is 3 years older than he is, a guy named Stokesy. And Sammy says, the only difference between me and Stokesy is he's married, he has 3 kids, and his ambition in life is to be the manager of this A&P someday, right? And Sammy is a floating character in the sense that he doesn't know what he wants out of life, but we get the sense that he doesn't want that. He doesn't want to be Stokesy. He doesn't want to keep working at the A&P for the rest of his life and, buy the little, house with the picket fence and have 3 kids and settle down. Fine for Stokesy, but Sammy seems to just sort of not want that. Now, he's so naive and so unworldly that he can't really give any voice to that. He just kind of seems to not, love the path that Stokesy has chosen. What does he want? He can't tell us. He's too unworldly. He can't put it into words. So there's a perfect floating character, just vaguely dissatisfied, right, with the path that he's on. Now then, if we didn't have any grounding of the plot, Sammy's probably going to be working in that grocery store 5 years from now because he doesn't know what he wants. He doesn't know how to break out. But instead, on this particular day, in walks these three young women in bathing suits into the A&P. And of course, this story is set in 1959. So this creates a huge stir that these young women with, gasp, their shoulders are uncovered and they're in the A&P. And so he sees everybody kind of eyeing them and he starts to feel bad for them, starts to feel sympathy for them. Let me make this as short as possible. At the end of the story, the manager comes over, embarrasses, humiliates these young women. And so Sammy decides he's going to be the big hero. And as they're leaving, he says to the manager, "I quit." Right? Now, then the timing of this ending is really important because they don't hear him. He thinks that he's going to be their knight in shining armor, but they don't hear him. They just leave. Right? So the manager says, "What did you say, Sammy?" And of course, since they didn't hear him, he's not going to be a knight in shining armor. The natural thing for him to say at that juncture is, "Never mind, get back to work." Instead, he says, "I said I quit." Right? So he doubles down. What is he quitting? He's quitting that life of the A&P. He's not doing it to impress these young women. They're gone. He's quitting the idea of being Stokesy. The manager says, "You don't know what you're doing." He says, "Yeah, you're right." And the manager says, "Your parents are going to be very disappointed." He says, "You're right again." He doesn't know what he wants yet, but he knows what he doesn't want. Now then, what forced him off of his own floatiness? Those three young women walking in the store. It's a grounded plot. It's a definite thing. Those three women exist in the real world. They're not a concept. And so they're in the store for 15 minutes. There's your ticking clock. If he's going to use them as a catalyst, or they're going to be his catalyst to quit this life this path that he's on, he has 15 minutes to make that decision. Right? So that's a perfect example of where we have a character who's just unhappy. He's on a path. He doesn't even know he's really unhappy, doesn't know how to break himself out of it. But here comes a grounded element by way of plot to force his hand and make him make a decision. All right. So that's a floaty-groundy. The character's floating, the plot is grounded. And when I teach this to my students, I always ask, well, let's say that Sammy's been working at this A&P for 1,000 days, several years. And, why are we telling the story of this day? Well, the obvious answer, because this is the day that the young women walked in. Something different happened, right? Something happened to force his hand. All right. So floaty-groundy can work the other way. If you've got a floating plot, it's not grounded at any particular time constraint or ticking clock. Let's take, for example, my example, the one I gave you before, the woman with the heroin addicted grown son living in her basement. That's a floating plot because there's no time frame around it. There are no constraints around it. As I said, he can be down there for a month. He can be down there for 6 months, 6 years, 16 years, right? In fact, you could argue that the floatiness of that plot, don't hear floatiness as a bad thing. Sammy's floatiness in A&P is what makes him interesting. He doesn't know what he wants, like a typical teenager. He doesn't know what he wants out of life. And for this woman, the example I'm giving, the woman with the heroin addicted son, the floatiness of that plot is what increases our tension. Now, usually we've been, our tightrope walker, it's the groundedness of the plot that increases the tension, but that's not always the case. Here, it's worse to have a heroin addict living in your basement for 6 years than it is to have a heroin addict living in your basement for 6 months. So the fact that there's no time constraint just increases the tension, right? So what I don't want anybody to hear is floaty's good, grounded's bad, or grounded's good, floating's bad. It's just how they combine in the story, all right? So this is a good kind of floating plot where she's got to, uh, she's got this son living in her basement, and he's just down there. It's convenient for him. It feeds his addiction, and he's not going anywhere. Right? There's nothing coming along to make him go anywhere. So where does the grounded element come from? It has to come from her. So we have to look at her. If I were writing that story, I have to look at her as, at some point, she's going to have to become the grounded element in this story, which means what? She's going to decide, I'm getting him out of here. I'm telling him he has to leave. It's time for tough love. This weekend, he's moving out, or I'm calling the cops. All right. And so now all of a sudden, we've got a grounded character. She wants something specific. She's not, if she were just a floaty character, she's unhappy about the situation. It's terrible. I wish this weren't my life. But now she's grounded herself. Actually, you're doing it, but it's by way of her, right? That she makes a decision. He's getting out. I'm putting him out of that basement this weekend. If he says no, I'm calling the police. Right now, this increases the tension of the story because this is going to take a lot of courage on her part. This is hard and heartbreaking for her to do. But now she's kind of given herself a ticking clock. She's given herself a constraint, right? So she's grounded. The character now is grounded in time. But that comes from her. That doesn't come from the outside, like three young women walking in the front door of the grocery store. All right. Now then, so, for me, the best stories, and again, I apply this to novels too, end up being these floaty-groundies, where you have a grounded element, whether it's in character or plot, and that keeps us turning pages, right? That gives us that sort of outside time frame, that outside constraint that makes us want to read what's going to happen. But because we've got a floating element, either character or plot, that gives us a chance to slow down, right? We're not just sort of racing the clock of our own book, our own story. We're not John McClane waiting for the building to explode. We can slow down a little bit because we've got one floating element in the story, and we can explore character a little bit more. We can get into the psychology of this heartbroken mother with her son in the basement. We can get into the psychology of Sammy and his naivete and how he sees the world, because the story slows down with that floating element, but it doesn't slow to the point where we get a lot of what I call walking on the beach scenes, where we start to skim. Because why? Well, we've got a grounded element in the background that makes us turn pages, right? So we want both. Now then, this is sort of like, this is sort of an optical illusion in a way. People will say to I've had people come to me and describe a story that they're working on and a character and say, well, which is floating and which should be grounded? And my answer is, it doesn't matter, right? The thing where the old drawing of, like, it's a woman sitting at her vanity, but it's also a skull. This is sort of like that. It's both. You're going to find that if you start applying this model, you tend to write one kind of character or the other, right? Or you tend to write one kind of plot or the other. I tend to write grounded characters, but then my plots are just meandering all over the place, right? So I've learned that to sort of rein in my own tendency to meander with plot, I've got to rein in the story with a grounded character, all right? That's what works for me. So as you start applying this model, you'll find out sort of what works for you. The other thing I'll say too is that this works really well for stories and novels where it's just that nagging feeling that something's not working here. And first of all, I'll say you should always trust that instinct. Um, if 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 you think you've written a story, it checks all the boxes, but you feel like it's just not working, you're not just being difficult with yourself. Trust that instinct. If you feel like it's just not working somehow, it's not. You're almost always right about that. So, I've found a lot of times that if I feel, even just at the level of a chapter, if I feel like this chapter is just not working, I'll go back and apply this floaty-groundy model, and I'll think, well, this is a floaty. That's what I tend to fall into. That's why it's not working. So I'll ground some element of that chapter. I'll add a ticking clock, right? What can that be? Anything. My character, I'll back up a little bit. He has a job interview and he's late for it. There's your ticking clock. That helps ground that part of the chapter. All right. So again, I've lost that sense of wanting to turn pages, but now that I've added the, late for a job interview, it's not Die Hard, but it's still something that we can relate to. And we don't, it gives us a little bit of tension that'll keep driving the story forward. So in time, as I said, if you keep consciously applying this model, you'll figure out that you tend to float one element, ground the other, or you tend to write floaties, or you tend to write groundies, and you'll see where you need to sort of mix it up. I need to add some floatiness to this story. I need to add some groundiness to this story. I got to ground, that's for me, it's almost always, I've got to ground one element or the other. All right, that's about all I have. I'm happy to answer some questions if anybody has any questions.
Well, Brad, just a kind of a quick one, and maybe there really isn't a differentiation, but how do you find yourself kind of working with this for young adult writing in contrast to writing novels for adults?
I don't think there's any difference. In fact, when I write for young adults, I really focus on how they're the same as writing for adults, and not on how they're different. That's been my approach in general to young adult fiction. And I've been kind of amazed at how some people think about young adult fiction. People will disdain it, and they're missing out on some great books. But I've even had other writers say, how do you dumb down your work for young adults? I'm like, you don't want to do that. I mean, young adults, if nothing else, have a built-in BS detector, and if you're talking down to them at all, they're going to be out in about 5 seconds. So it's really the same thing that I will say, maybe, as a young adult reader, maybe they want to be kept in the story a little bit more. Busy heads, busy lives, shorter attention span. So I think having that grounded element, I'm always looking for that. Every chapter, I kind of think, what's my grounded element in this chapter? Now, as I said, that's for me because I tend to do fine with writing floaty, angsty characters. That's my strength. So I've got to pay attention to my weakness, which is, do I have a grounding element here? So I'm not just going off and doing lots of pretty writing. And, I always ask myself that, where in this chapter am I grounded? If I have that, I know the chapter is going to work.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, one of the things that I notice, because I sometimes read young adult fiction and really enjoy it, that part of why I do really enjoy it is because the pacing is kind of more to my taste.
Right.
If I'm just trying to kind of, have the pleasure of reading a book. And so it seems like maybe it's that kind of increase of the groundy element.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like I said, I mean, I think deep down, most readers want that, no matter what kind. I mean, it can be the most, very important fiction in the world. And but we still want to feel compelled to turn pages. I think as readers, we don't ever really, the most important question for readers to ask is what's going to happen next. And I don't care. I don't care if it's a children's book or if it's Anna Karenina. I think that question is always there, should be always there.
Well, Brad, I mean, thank you so much. I don't even write fiction, and I've got a page full of notes.
Oh, good.
So thank you for that.
Sure.
And thank you for your time, and I'm so grateful for it, and for this kind of framework, very practical framework of the craft talk. We're
You're welcome.
Yeah, really appreciate it.
Sure thing. All right. Take care.